This is Peter Parker from the Melbourne On Transit blog. Something different this week, how bus routes in Melbourne got their current numbers. There have been previous bus route numbering schemes, but what we have now basically started in 1971, when all the bus routes in Melbourne were renumbered. The 1971 scheme had numbers only with a 3-digit system. The first digit either represented the bus operator or geographical area. The last 2 digits were basically unique identifiers. There wasn't anything below route 200. A lot of 1 and 2 digit numbers, though, were used by trams. The 200s and 300s were government-run routes. The Tramways Board operated those. These were mostly in areas that didn't have trams, or in some cases, the government took over failed private bus operators. Those routes were particularly prevalent in areas like Footscray, where they replaced the tram system that was closed in the early 1960s, Sunshine, even as far out as Deer Park, the inner north, areas like Clifton Hill and Heidelberg, and also a large wedge in the east around Doncaster and Warrandyte. Also some of the inner south like Brighton and Gardenvale also had 200 series routes. There were also some 300 series routes, again operated by the Tramways Board. They were mostly freeway express routes from the Doncaster-Manningham area. The 400s to 800s were private operators. The 400s were Western Melbourne, areas like Sunshine, that is, those routes run by private operators, not by government, which was also active in the area. Footscray, Yarraville, Werribee, Sunbury, St Albans, all those areas had 400 route numbers assigned. 500s, that was more the north. Areas like Brunswick, Coburg, Greensborough, Epping, Broadmeadows, all 500 route numbers. You can see there's almost an order in areas like Brunswick for the routes that run east-west. You've still got routes like 503, 506, 510, 508 that run parallel east-west routes. Then it becomes a little messier as you go further out. But very roughly, the 400s were Melbourne's west, 500s Melbourne's north. The north had a lot of smaller bus operators then, as was also the case in a lot of other areas as well, but especially in the north, the smaller operators survived much longer than other parts of Melbourne. And anyway, all those had to share the 500 series for their services in Melbourne's north. Over in the east and the south, it becomes a bit more complicated because the road network is much more connected. There are fewer gaps, whereas if you were to go back especially in the past, before the Western Ring Road, the west was very clearly split off from the north, and there was also a bit of a division between the north and the east. However, in the south and east, that was pretty much contiguous. So you've got a mixture of numbers, 600s, 700s, and 800s. The two big operators, and they would later become bigger and bigger, were Ventura and Grenders. Grenders, based around Dandenong, had the 800 series. Ventura was largely 700 series, and that still remains largely the case today. Although later on, Grenders and Ventura were to become part of the Ventura group, the same operator. Though bearing in mind in 1971, there were a lot of smaller bus operators as well. The 600s, you had areas around Brighton, Moorabbin, A lot of their routes were 600 series in the 1971 renumbering, although a lot of them got removed and changed to 800 series when bus operators amalgamated and they tended to merge their routes. So there's a lot of routes from the Dandenong area that go through to the Brighton area. I'm talking about routes like 811, 812, 828. Previously, they were shorter routes, and you might have had a 600 route number in Moorabbin and Brighton, and 800 series in areas like Springvale and Dandenong. 600s, you also had a lot of numbers around the Croydon area. These were run by Invicta. Again, Invicta was taken over by Grenda, that was in turn taken over by Ventura. But back in the early to mid 70s, areas around Croydon, Lilydale were expanding, and you had 600 series route numbers out there. Think of routes like 693 along Ferntree Gully Road. Another main one is 670 between Ringwood and Lilydale. 600 series routes there. And also you go in a bit further into the city in the southeast, areas around Oakley also had the 600s, lower numbers 600s, like 623 is a major route from Glen Waverley to St Kilda via Chadstone. Back in 1971, they were shorter routes. The general tendency was to have shorter routes, and as operators bought each other's out, they tended to amalgamate routes. Sometimes you could save buses there. Sometimes you could reduce frequencies in inner areas and improve frequencies in outer areas, joining the routes up. So there were some things done there. Another case where bus route numbers changed was in Cranbourne. Initially, they were 700 route numbers series, the high 700s. In fact, the high 700s was also used on the Mornington Peninsula, most notably the 788, which was the main route and still is the main route down the peninsula. But the high 700s were also used in the Cranbourne area, although there was much later on network restructuring that made most, if not all, of the Cranbourne routes 800s as well. But generally speaking, the 800s were around Dandenong, Narrewarren and Springvale, and they stretched, as I mentioned before, further west, as far west as Brighton areas when routes were amalgamated. Knox was then, and still is, a bit of a no man's land for buses. It seemed as if bus operators wanted something running in their area so they could stake a claim, but service was never any good, and that still is the case today. So if you look at areas like around Stud Park, Knox City, you've got bus routes that are 600 series. They might have been old Invicta routes, 700 series, and it was all a bit of a mess. So you might have some routes that run just token services, like one trip a day, like Route 745 and its variations. It's almost as if they were put in there just so that a bus operator can say that we operate in this area, even though the service provided wasn't very useful. And in the case of Knox, a lot of the bus timetables have not changed for 30, 40 or more years. So you've still got that case of remnant routes. Only a few routes operate a particularly good service there. Now, we haven't mentioned the 900s. Now, the 900s have been used for different sorts of routes. Go back to the 1970s, and you still had some routes run by Victorian Railways. That was typically where, if a line was removed, like the Kew, the outer circle line, the line that went from Kew to Camberwell, that became one of the 900 series routes, as that was replaced by a bus service. Similarly, you've got routes like the 901 was a route that went from Sandringham through to Beaumaris. That was a route that there was previously a Victorian Railways operated tramways service that ran for several decades, but then it wouldn't pay. It was shut down, and so that became a bus instead. So that was operated by the Victorian Railways and coordinated with the trains, and that operated as a feeder service. There was also another 900 series route up in the Broadmeadows, Coolaroo area. That was where there was plans for rail electrification extension and new station to serve the growing housing areas around Coolaroo. That did not happen for many, many years afterwards, but in the interim, there was a 900 series bus route that was put in to feed passengers Coolaroo into Broadmeadows Station. So there were routes 901, 902, 903 that operated as Victorian Railways type bus routes that were intended to feed with the train, either because the train or tram service was removed or because it was considered a developmental area and there was growth, and before they had funding to put in a train, they thought they'd run a bus instead to maintain a connected service. Those routes sort of fizzled out and got renumbered later on, like in the Sandringham area. Much later on, the 901 became the 600 and also ran to Southland, and also became part of, still government owned, became part of MetBus. And so even now you see the timetable of 600 has longer operating hours to reflect that legacy. Bit later on, though, there were some other splits that I'll talk about a little bit later on, because we're still on the 900s. Another reason for using the 900s was when the late night buses, there was interest in night rider routes. In the 90s, they were introduced, and then probably would have been late 90s. Anyway, they got route numbers, and they were again assigned numbers in the 900s because they were separate routes. They were only operated during the late night periods of Friday, Saturday evening, and so they thought, well, they should give them a distinctive route number, and these are very different routes. They weren't anything like existing routes in the numbers below 900. So the Night Rider later became Night Network. They got their own routes numbers allocated in the 900 series, generally mid-900s generally. Bit later on, you had improvements to buses, including the coming of SmartBuses, which were routes that ran more frequently, over longer hours, and with a bit more bus priority than regular routes. These were main routes, often cross-suburban orbitals, and also routes to areas where there might have been promises of a train that was not implemented, but a better bus service was provided instead. And so the 900s, the early 900 numbers, 901, 902, 903, they were recycled decades later to form 3 orbital bus routes. They were all running by the end of 2010. These orbital routes provide cross-suburban travel. You had Route 900 as well. That started in 2006, and that was basically a substitute for a train to Rowville. So that runs from Caulfield via Monash Uni to Rowville, and that provides a higher frequency than you got for the average bus, longer operating hours, and so that was Route 900 SmartBus. It's been quite popular, and that was basically what the government provided instead of rail to Rowville. So the 900 was one of the smart buses. There are also other smart bus routes, especially in the Doncaster area. Again, that has been an area that there have been various calls for train services or trams. None of that has actually been provided. Of course, the suburban rail loop does offer the potential of a train service, but not in the first stage that's currently being built. That will have to wait till later stage. That will go from Box Hill through to Doncaster and then SRL North. But anyway, the interim is improved bus service, and so you had the Dart or Doncaster area rapid transit. These were smart buses. These were routes 905, 906, 907 and 908. And these are routes that express buses that go into the city via the freeway, and then in the Doncaster, Donvale, Warrandyte area, they fan out to provide a pretty good local coverage for a lot of the city of Manningham. But they were SmartBus routes. Again, I should mention that SmartBus routes are typically every 15 minutes on weekdays, 30 minutes evenings and weekends, although some of the routes, especially 907 and 905, have much more recently been upgraded, so they're every 15 minutes on weekends as well. Interestingly, you've got one SmartBus, which is Route 703, that remains with its non-Route 900 number. It's neither an orbital nor has it been upgraded to full SmartBus standards in regards to operating hours. So 703 is a regular bus route number that is sort of a SmartBus, or at least part of it, the Blackburn to Monash or Clayton bit, but it still hasn't got the full SmartBus treatment, so it remains with its non-SmartBus number. Another use for the 900s were overflow numbers, and that was first used in the early 2000s. There was a bus network reform in around August 2002, and that bus network reform added bus services on Sundays on some outer suburban routes. There were also some changes in the Brighton and Sandringham area. At the time, you had bus routes 600, which was a frequent route running between Sandringham and Beaumaris and Southland. Then you had other routes, 822, 823 were local routes that were somewhat convoluted, almost hairpin shaped in some ways. And those numbers, as I mentioned before, 800 series, normally you'd think of them as being Dandenong area routes, but when Grenders expanded, you had a lot of 800 bus routes appearing not only just in Dandenong but also in the Brighton area. The 2002 changes made some cutbacks, and they pruned some bus routes and they made some new route numbers. Anyway, what happened was that instead of being a frequent service from Sandringham to Beaumaris, then Southland on a single route number, that was the 600, that was every 15 minutes, they thought, well, okay, they would split off some of the 600 trips and they would route them as a slight variant of the 600. So the 600 itself would go to every 30 minutes, and using some of the route kilometres to go on these new routes. And those new routes got numbers 922 and 923. They're only very limited service routes. They might have gaps of 60 to 90 minutes and limited operating hours. But anyway, they replaced the reason for the 922 and 923 being numbered. I think the reason for that is they replaced sections of the old 822 and 823 that got cut back. Those routes still exist, but in shorter form, and the parts that were cut were replaced by 922 and 923. So I think that's the reason for them getting 900 route numbers, even though it doesn't make sense, which is a problem if you're trying to look up bus routes in a list such as on a website. You're looking at 600 and then you have to scroll a long way down for the 900 series. So it wasn't done particularly well. Anyway, we've stuck with this legacy because bus routes haven't been reviewed properly in the Sandringham area for many, many years after that 2002 change. Another area that got 900 series routes as regular routes is Pakenham. Before that, the only Pakenham route you had was the 826 that went all the way from, I was going to say Hyatt, but no, it actually started at Hampton, went all the way from Hampton to Pakenham, went via a lot of other areas like Keysborough, Dandenong, Berwick, etc. But anyway, 826 was a very, very long route. That got shortened, and the Pakenham end became 926. And then later on, as Pakenham grew, you got some other route numbers, like there's a 925, 927, 928, 929. Some of those were combined later on. And anyway, basically Pakenham local routes are in the 920s. So that remains today. Now, what has changed since? Well, some areas have expanded, particularly in the west and the north, and they were almost threatening to run out of route numbers. Whereas there were never very many routes in the 300s, and there were a lot of spare numbers in the 600s. The 800s were pretty full of numbers, but even more so the 500s and the 400s. Because of very fast growth in Melbourne's west and north. So what happened was when there was a chance to reform bus networks, they often got new bus route numbers. Point Cook in 2013 was interesting. They got numbers, their previous numbers were 413, 416 in the low 400s. They got the high 400s. So you've got routes like 495, 494, 497. They were added when the Point Cook bus network was completely redone when Williams Landing Station opened. A little bit after that, in 2015, the area around Werribee, Tarneet, that got huge bus network reform. There were some bus routes that stayed pretty close to what they were before, particularly south of the railway line, like 439, 441, retained similar to their existing route, only some minor changes there. They kept their 400 route numbers, but a lot of the other areas, like Werribee routes, were initially in the 400 block, around 430, 440. Anyway, all that got changed, so they became routes in the 100 series. So, of course, you've still got tram route 109, but you still had, apart from that, you had some school bus routes that were around the 160 series in Melbourne's northeast, around Kew area, I think. But they were only used for school times. And so the thinking was that to cater for the growth in the west, you should free up some route numbers, and the 100 series from 150 to 200, they were unused. So that is the numbers that they got in the western areas around Werribee and Tarneet. So generally speaking, the main road routes there have numbers ending in 0, like 150, 160, 170, 180, 190 are all main road routes. Not all of them, some of them are frequent all day, not all of them are. And then you've got some others in between for some of the more local routes. So the Werribee's got 150 through to 190. In fact, there's 191, 192 in that block. And meanwhile, that means that you've got all these freed up numbers in the 430 and 440 series, and they have begun to be used in parts of the corridor out to Melton. Because previously there was a big area between Caroline Springs and Melton that was pretty much just open. You just had the train line going through, not many houses. But anyway, since then, that area has started to fill up. So you've got some routes in the 430, 440 area going in there. And that is a good complement for Melton Town, which has long had route numbers in the 450s. There is a routes in the 450s like around Sunshine and Deer Park, like 454, which is an old Sunshine West route, and 451. That was basically got rid of when the Sunshine or Brimbank network got reformed in 2014. You had some changes there to bus routes, and so again, that created some extra numbers in the 450s that could be reused out further west. And also Caroline Springs, when that developed, you had route numbers in the 460, 461, 462, 463. Although if you have a look at, you've still got Route 215. That runs from Caroline Springs to High Point. And that Route 200 number is a remnant of when it was government owned, a government run, as that was an old Tramways Board route. Then with privatisation, you got two bus operators, private bus operators were set up, National Bus and Melbourne Bus Link. National Bus mainly in the Doncaster area and parts of the north, and Melbourne Bus Link was basically routes that went from the Sunshine area through to Brighton, Garden Vale, those sorts of areas. That was all combined under Transdev and now Kinetic. Anyway, you've still got those remnant route numbers from there. So the 215 is one of the older type of route numbers there, as is the 216, 220, and for a long time the 219 out in the west. You've also got cases where you had Route 219 had variations south of Sunshine. That got changed to a 429, and 429 is more in keeping with the 400 series in the Sunshine area. So there have been some changes of bus route numbers to a more sensible structure there. The other area was Melbourne's north. That's also very fast growing, and the 500s, they were close to running out there. Now, the 300s were hardly used. They're used for only a small number of freeway express buses from the Doncaster area. There's still a few that have the 300s, like 305, 309, a couple of others, but really not very many. So when they looked at reforming buses in Melbourne's north, which they did around the time that South Morang line, and then that was extended to Mernda, so you had a new bus network for areas like Doreen. That previously had numbers in the 500 series, and they became 300 series there. And same with Wollert, that also had a handful of routes in the 500s. That's now all 300 series. So parts of the outer north now have 300s. So the idea is that the west has 100s and 400s, the north has 500s, and more recently 300s. Some of those areas you've got stations that have both 500 and 300 numbers. And if there's an orbital SmartBus as well, there'll be might be an orbital 900 call-in as there, and also maybe a 900 series night network bus if that's in the area. Something else I should mention is university shuttle routes. The earlier ones were the 601 to Monash Uni and the 401 across from North Melbourne to Melbourne Uni. The 601 was sort of a compensation for not providing a train from Huntingdale through to Monash Clayton. Anyway, that runs very, very frequently, has been very successful, and is pretty much a turn-up-and-go service with buses every few minutes. And so the numbers ending in 01 have tended to be used for some of the university shuttles. So you've got not only the 601 Huntingdale to Monash, the 401, that's North Melbourne to Melbourne Uni. That was put in, I think one of the rationales was to lessen train and tram crowding, because before that, people would have to sort of backtrack. They'd have to get their train to Melbourne Central and then jump on a tram to go north to Melbourne Uni. And so the 401 was put in to offer an alternative there that people could cut across from North Melbourne Station. And there's also likely to be changes to that when the Metro Tunnel opens on the 1st of February. Likely to be rethinking there with bus routes, university shuttles, likely to affect the 401 as well. And other university shuttles, well, there's the 301, that is Reservoir to La Trobe Uni. You've already got the 561 across there, which is a longer route, but that's only every 20 minutes, whereas the 301 is every 10 minutes. So it provides a turn-up-and-go service. Only problem with that is that the train it connects to, the Mernda line, is still only every 20 minutes most of the time. So you're still taking your chances with connections if you're going from the bus to the train. Another route as well, a university shuttle route, was or is the 201 from Box Hill to Deakin. That's not quite as frequent as the other university shuttles. It's every 15 minutes, although that meshes with trains at Box Hill, which also operate on a 15-minute base frequency. In fact, as a point of trivia, there were actually two Deakin University shuttles. There was the 768, which was like every 30 or 40 minutes, and the 201, which I think at the time was every 20 minutes, and that didn't harmonise with the train. So you had that, and it made getting buses from Box Hill to Deakin Uni quite complicated. Fortunately, common sense prevailed, and the 768 was rolled into upgraded services on the 201. And you've also had some other changes. So the 903 was routed to run via Deakin Uni, so that is also an option from Box Hill. There's some other shuttle routes as well that because the route 201 was already used, but there's the route 202 as well that goes from Victoria Park, actually a bit east of there. That goes to Melbourne Uni as an east-west route, so that will help people connecting from the Clifton Hill group of lines. But again, there may be changes to that with the metro tunnel. I think there is a determination to restructure buses running east-west in the corridor through Arden and Parkville, and that may have implications for routes like the 401 and the 202. We'll no doubt find out about that probably early next year or even later this year. Another route ending in 01 is the 501. Now that is a shuttle, a sort of a shuttle express type service, but it's not tied up with a university, and that is basically because Donnybrook doesn't have electric trains. It's only got infrequent V-line trains. It's a fast-growing area, so the idea was to put on a bus that connects with trains at Craigieburn and run that to Donnybrook. So that is the route 501, which is a relatively recent addition. Unlike some cities, like Adelaide, we are mercifully free of having letters on bus route numbers. However, there are a couple of exceptions. For example, 695F, the F being for Fountain Gate, is a variant of route 695. This is an odd variant that runs 3 days a week, Fridays, Saturdays and Sundays, to connect parts of the far outer east, in fact the semi-rural far outer east like Emerald and Gembrook, with a trip running all the way south to Fountain Gate Shopping Centre. Very different to the regular 695, although it does share some stops with it. Also in the outer east, but a bit closer in, is 745, which has variants of 745A, 745B, 745C and 745D. Basically one trip each. I suspect they're only put there just so that a bus operator could say that they operate buses in Knox, even though they're hardly useful and probably hardly used, being just one trips at odd times. But anyway, that's route 745, and it's A, B, C and D variants from Bayswater Station, or at least in that area. Quite some time ago, there were trips on route 630. Route 630 is the North Road route, ends up at Monash Uni. And before the 601 shuttle, which provided express trips, there were extra trips on the route 630 between Huntingdale and Monash Uni. And that was, for a time, referred to as 630A. But that disappeared quite a long time ago. Also, quite a long time ago, you might have seen on various network maps, 624 splits off in the Caulfield Carnegie area, One bit goes via Carnegie, the other bit goes via D or Darling Road. You might have seen maps that had 624C, 624D, but I don't think they were ever displayed on the fronts of buses as unique route numbers. 513 had a similar arrangement. Half the trips went via Lower Plenty, the other half went via Greensborough. There might have been maps that showed it 513LP, 513G. Don't quite remember. Some might correct me on that if that was the case. Anyway, that has since been changed. You've now got 513 and 514. There are some cases of circular routes. Some just operate in a single direction. Some operate in both directions, clockwise and anti-clockwise. An example of a single directional route is the 582 in Eltham. There was a route 380 which went from Ringwood to Croydon. Then it did a loop, and that was one route number for both directions, and that was very confusing because it meant that people went the wrong way on buses if they got on the wrong side of the road. Anyway, that has since been changed so that there are now two route numbers for the 380. And instead of those being 300 series route numbers, they're actually in the 600s, 668 and 669. Overall, that's made things much simpler. And the high 600s is also compatible with other routes in the Ringwood area. The main difference historically was that the 600s were privately run, normally run by Invicta, whereas the 300s are a legacy of government operation, which has since been put out to private franchise. Another variation of loop routes, you had the 834 and 835 in the Narrowrowan Berwick area. In this case, one of them was clockwise, the other was anti-clockwise. Anyway, they simplified it so that the northern half is one route number and the southern half is another route number. When the Point Cook network commenced in 2013, although routes 494 and 495 from Williams Landing Station to Point Cook South do function operationally as a circular route, you've actually just got one route number that goes down to the terminus, then at the terminus it changes and forms the other route number. So on the map it looks like they are just regular linear bus routes, but if you want to go to a destination that is beyond the terminus, then you can stay on the bus and the bus will keep going to get to it. There are cases of routes that were separate, that were joined up to form a single route, and the result has been very, very confusing. A prime example of that is the 566 that goes from Laylaw to Northland via Greensborough, but there's actually stops where buses in both directions actually stop there. There's double backing, and you definitely wouldn't go from one end to the other unless you were an enthusiast. It's just very slow, a lot of backtracking, and that should really have been split into two separate route numbers. There's a couple of similar cases in the east. You would argue that route 735 and 736 are like that as well. And the result is that when you see a destination that's only a couple of kilometres from your origin, you realise that maybe this isn't the bus for you. And the real destination in the case of the 736 is Glen Waverley, and ideally that would have been split into two route numbers, as no one would ride that from end to end. There is a similar situation with the old 627, not the current 627, but the old 627 that went from Elstonwick, went up to Chadstone and then finished in the Bayside suburbs, not far from Elstonwick. Anyway, that got simplified, so it became 625 and 626, and so they're both relatively direct, straight routes, and that made catching those buses much easier. There are still examples where that hasn't done, or one route tries to do too much, and a major example of that is in Northwest Reservoir, where the 558 has a midday reversal. It's a bit like the City Rail Loop. It reverses direction in the middle of the day, and also like the City Rail Loop, at least some parts of it that still have the reversal, it's a different direction on Saturday mornings compared to weekday mornings. There's also various diversions and extensions that only happen on some trips. As for Saturday afternoons, well, there's no service since the timetable reflects a time around 40 or so years ago when there wasn't Saturday afternoon trading. It was just Monday to Saturday morning, and many of the bus timetables reflected that. Unlike some other cities, Melbourne generally doesn't have separate route numbers for short workings. That is, routes that serve all the same stops of a longer route but finish earlier or start a bit later somewhere along it. The one exception, though, is the 478. The 478 and 479 routes operate as a pair between Airport West tram terminus and Melbourne Airport, with 479 extending to Sunbury. So the 478 is basically just a shorter version of the 479, and on weekdays, generally every second trip is a 478 alternating with 479, going the full distance to Sunbury. On weekends, it's a bit different, where nearly all the trips are 478, except 479, which are a couple of trips that go the full length to Sunbury. But generally speaking, we are quite economical in our use of route numbers, with short workings not given a separate route number. It was different in the past, particularly on some of the government-owned or operated routes, where you did have short workings for some routes with their own route number. Another variation, particularly when far more of the routes didn't run 7 days, were special routes that were weekends only. I think there was one or two in the Frankston area, maybe in the northern suburbs. Route 769 rings a bell. 832 might have been another. But these were basically different routes that operated on weekends to provide a limited weekend service when the other routes didn't run. That also reminds me of 801 and 803. They were routes put in by I think they might have been funded by the city of Greater Dandenong, but this was a case where the regular routes didn't run on weekends in areas of Springvale, Noble Park, Dandenong, and these special routes were operated, I think, for a temporary trial. Getting back to routes with letters, there was a 571A that was in the outer northern suburbs, ran to Epping, I think. That was operated, I think it might have been paid for by the bus operator, might have been separate fares, but it was then an outer area, a service that the government didn't fund. Then later it did, and it got folded into the 901 orbital. Speaking about orbitals, there were some routes, old routes, that were prior to becoming orbitals. You had the 888 and 889. They were down Springvale Road, and that became part of a much bigger 902 orbital. Also, you had 291 between Heidelberg and Box Hill, and 700 between Box Hill and Mentone Mordialloc. That became part of the 903 orbital. Both of those, before they became orbitals, were quite long-standing historic bus routes. In some cases, extensions started off as being extensions, and then they got their own route number, although there's been some variations, like the 706, for instance, a little route between Mordialloc and Chelsea. At one time it operated as an independent route, then it became a few extended trips on the 700, and now its own little route again. So there have been variations backwards and forwards. Some routes didn't have route numbers or had informal route numbers. There is a service known as the bus, which was not funded and or considered part of the regular network. That was on the Mornington Peninsula. Anyway, that became the route 787. So it became a regular route. It's still a limited service timetable, but it is part of the network and it accepts all the normal ticket types and it's got all the normal information on the PTV Transport Victoria website. But before that, that was sort of like a special purpose route. So that's just a bit of a summary of how Melbourne's bus route numbering came to be. Generally in Melbourne, we are reluctant to change bus route numbers. In Perth, they are a bit different. They will try to change a bus route number to improve legibility. But in Melbourne, we've still got cases where you might have a bus route, like I mentioned, the 600, 922 and 923. You've got cases where you've got routes that are 80 or 90% identical. It's very complicated to find out, when the next bus is, especially if you're at a stop that's served by 2 or 3. It would have been better if those routes were in consecutive number orders. You've got a few cases where that is still so. For instance, you've got routes 411 and 412 out from Footscray through to Laverton. They mostly share a common corridor, but they split off from one another in Altona North. Just trying to think of some of the others where you've got consecutive numbers that form a frequent combined corridor. 578, 579 between Warrandyte and Eltham. They form a bit of a common corridor. Also 811 and 812 go from Brighton to Dandenong, but for parts of it, especially at the Dandenong end, they do split off before recombining in Brighton area. Brighton Moorabbin area, 811, 812 run along the same corridor. One case that you did have bus routes that were carefully timed and planned for that were the 802, 804 and 862. Ideally, they should have had consecutive numbers. The 803 number, for instance, is not used. These are routes that go from Chadstone to Dandenong. Again, they form a common corridor from Chadstone through Oakley, Monash Uni, and a bit east before fanning out on their trips towards Dandenong. Also, their timetables have become a little bit more uneven. So, although I think an effort is made for 802 and 804, which share a common section through parts of Dandenong North and past Dandenong Hospital, I think there's an attempt to stagger them at 20 minutes, but they are partly a common corridor that doesn't quite have consecutive route numbers. But generally speaking, in Melbourne, we don't have a habit of trying to simplify bus routes and bus route numbers unless there's an area review, and that's very patchy. Some areas have had area reviews, some have not for many years. So that explains when you look at maps of areas like around Knox, you've got all different bus route numbers, bus routes, and that is an interesting snapshot of the history. A lot of it comes down to either if a bus route was government or privately operated. Another comes down to the area. Another comes down to if routes have been extended to cover other areas, then you might have a greater range of bus route numbers in different blocks. So it's not very tidy, but it's what we have. If you've got any comments or have any further insights, then please share them in the comments below.